One of the most important public policy issues facing this country has self-evidently been energy. We are, as you all know, blessed with abundant energy reserves. However, during the past decade, we've had several divisive debates about energy and climate. We all know about the emissions trading scheme, carbon taxes, renewable energy targets, and of course, most recently, the National Energy Guarantee. So how do we shore up cheap and reliable energy, curb carbon emissions, and respond to rapid technological change in energy? Well, today, CIS is pleased to introduce one of the major players in the energy debate in this country, indeed the world. For the past year, Audrey Zibelman has been the Managing Director and CEO of the Australian Energy Market Operator. That, of course, is the independent gas and electricity system and market operator in the country. AEMO, as it's known, has the responsibility of managing and maintaining energy system security for all Australians, which of course means our guest speaker has one of the toughest jobs in the country. Audrey is recognised as a national and international expert in energy policy. She has had extensive experience in the public, private and not-for-profit energy and electricity sectors in the United States, most recently having held the positions of Commissioner and Chair of the New York State Public Service Commission. She was, little known fact, according to the Financial Review, one of Hillary Clinton's hot picks to lead the US Department of Energy. That, of course, was before the Donald spoiled the party. Now AEMO is due to deliver its audit of the grid's coal plants to the government in coming weeks. In a preview report in the Financial Review just a few weeks ago, Audrey was quoted as saying, quote, "The best consumer outcomes would come from letting the market decide rather than becoming obsessed with any one supplier or energy source. Let the market decide." Audrey, as a think tank that champions markets and freedom, you are more than welcome here at CIS. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Audrey Zibelman.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm looking forward to actually the questions and conversation. This is one of the things we used to talk about in New York is how do we increase energy literacy, and one of the things I've discovered in Australia is everyone's literate. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. To me, I've been in this industry since 1988. And it was an industry when I entered into it. It was just at the beginning of competition. Actually, we had gone through competition in telecom, and people were starting to talk about independent power producers as opposed to generators owned by public utilities. And at that point, it was an industry that sort of thought of itself in decades. Things didn't move very, very quickly. And as monopolies, they had very patient capital and would try to wait out change, particularly change around disruptors. And when I was in New York, we were talking about this. I was at a panel, and I was with the former head of the Federal Communications Commission, who oversaw the telecommunications industry, just when internet was happening, and they were thinking about what that meant to the telecommunications industry. And then there was a utility CEO, and I thought it resonated with me. Is the utility CEO said, we were talking about disruptive change around solar and wind, and he said, look, it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen. I think it was a Wall Street conference, so he was probably talking to his investment community and bondholders. But he said it's going to happen, but it's not going to happen very quickly. The industry will adjust. It's nothing to worry about. And the telecom commissioner said something that I thought was great. He said, the fact of the matter is everyone today is sitting here with something in their pocket which 10 years ago would have had no meaning to anybody and wouldn't have worked. And telecom industry sort of had the same sense. It was going to happen, but they would adjust. It would happen slowly. And what's happening now in the energy industry, not just in Australia, worldwide, is that disruption is occurring. and it's occurring in a way that this industry has never seen. And what we're really trying to think about is how do we manage the institutional changes in a way that continues to make sure that the industry and the system as a whole continues to provide values to consumers because of the very fact that we're talking about essential industries, and there really is no substitute. We do need it to work. So what I thought I would do today is really outline what I say or think of as some of the 10 key disruptors to the industry and how they're affecting us. And I would think from the very beginning, and I'll just say this once, is that none of these are unique to Australia. We're feeling them in a different way, but it's really happening worldwide, and it's affecting the way everyone's thinking about it. So the first is, and the one we talk about most, and you hear about most, is the falling cost of renewables. I mean, it's fallen so radically, wind and solar, that where before people didn't think it would hit grid parity for another 10 years, is now they're saying it's grid parity now. In Australia, it's now. It's become increasingly cheap, and it's become the preferred investment for many people in the industry. The other thing, and so from an AEMO standpoint, we've said all of these things in various publications. We get requests for connection into the system. If we look at our connection requests over right now that exist, there's over 20,000 megawatts of connection requests. Almost all of it is wind and solar. Very little of anything else. So that's happening. Not I'm suggesting all of it will be built, but it's just to tell you where people are investing, where they want to put their money. The other is rooftop solar. Australia is the biggest pickup of rooftop solar anywhere. We're seeing essentially a power plant be built almost every season with people putting more and more rooftop solar. So where before AEMO wouldn't care if the clouds stopped shining on a city, it didn't really matter. Now we can use 200, 300 megawatts of power, which is the size of a big power plant, instantaneously, just because cloud cover comes over a city and we lose all that solar. So suddenly rooftop solar has had a huge impact, both in terms of what's happening on a sunny day. So in touring the day now, we'll see, and for example, in South Australia and Western Australia and increasingly in Queensland, very, very low load. Almost where typically we would say 1,000 megawatts, we'll see less than 500 megawatts. What that means, though, it sort of sounds like a good thing, except if you happen to be running a coal plant. And that coal plant is bigger than 500 megawatts. And so we have a problem. Because if the coal plant is not running and goes cold on us, and suddenly the sun stops shining, I can't get that plant back on. And so we have to start thinking about, well, what does that mean? Because we really can't afford to have the load dip that much. And then when it comes back, and this is what we saw in Queensland this summer, when the sun sets at 7 or 8 and it's still hot and everyone puts on their now very sizable air conditioners because they can afford them because they have all this free energy, suddenly the load comes back up and the system has become very peaky. And it happens after the sun stops shining. So the system has really changed in its topology, where before we used most of the energy in the afternoon. Now we're starting to use it in the evening. And the rate of change of energy, where it used to be would be a very slow, predictable change, is very fast, and it could be affected not just by people putting on their lights and the sun setting, but the wind stopped blowing. And so we're seeing a highly variable system that we have to manage, very different than before. So that's a big disruptor. The third disruptor that's happening is storage, all types of storage. We're seeing storage being put in with solar. We're seeing large-scale storage, like the Musk plant in Hornsdale. And we're seeing more and more demonstration, which is very valuable because energy has been as a unique product, electricity in particular, because it's the only product that has to be consumed and produced simultaneously and really can't be stored. So now it's really changing, and we have to think about how we use storage. And we were just sitting at lunch. It's a different animal. We always think of things either you consume or you produce. Now we have something that consumes and produces. So what is it? It's very different, and learning how to adjust to it. The other piece that's happening is we're going to have mobile storage. It's often called electric vehicles. So suddenly we're going to have cars plugging in, consuming and producing at various times where we're not quite sure where it's going to happen. And so one of the things I remember, and I was working with the head of the Washington, D.C. distribution utility, this is some years ago, but we were talking about this phenomenon, is that in Washington, D.C. on July 4th, our Independence Day, there's like 100,000 times more cars, I don't know how many more, but drive into Washington, D.C. than there is on any typical day, because everyone goes to the nation's capital to celebrate Independence Day. And we were saying, well, what if they're all electric vehicles? Suddenly, they're all coming in, they're charging up, and you've got a spike in your system that you didn't anticipate, and you don't know when it's going to hit. So these kind of things are really having utilities have to rethink it, and that's just a part of it. So I'm up to 3. 4 is the price of gas and coal. We're certainly seeing it here. We're seeing it internationally. Here, it's an increase. Domestic in U.S., it's a decrease. So gas prices in the U.S., when I was in the, used to be, people would think it would never go below $4 a BTU. City gate gas going into New York City when I left was less than $1. It's totally changed the industry on how people think about gas and also how they think about coal and nuclear. So it's having a radical change that nobody anticipated. Here we obviously have the issue of prices are higher, and that's affecting the industry as well. The other piece is in terms of technology around the edge, blockchain. So, you think about the banking industry and how cybercurrency and blockchain has changed the way people think about banking. Think about in the energy industry. Everything used to be a centralized exchange. The whole transaction system was always between the utility and the generator and the consumer. What if that happens around the edge and the utility has no role in it? What does that mean to the system where we depended on visibility and knowledge in order to run the system, and now we have blockchain and all these microsystems going on that we don't even see? So we'll have situations where suddenly we'll see a vast change in our system, and we'll realize that someone just put in a massive solar plant behind the meter, and we didn't even know it because they didn't have to tell us, but for us, it's a major change in how the system works. So those are very important to us. Building efficiency is changing, so the other thing that's changing is our load shape. This industry was built in the 1970s, or post-World War II, where there was really a rate of change was every utility in every OECD country was really dependent on the fact that you had 2 to 3% demand increase year over year as the economy shifted and we became electrification. We've now almost saturated that. And so in Europe, the US, and Australia, we're actually seeing demand flatten and decrease, which you could say is a good thing, because what's happening is buildings are becoming more efficient, manufacturing's becoming more efficient, it's changing. But the other piece that's happening is we have very old infrastructure. So a lot of our infrastructure has to be replaced, and it was built at a time where you had increasing demand. And so the challenge becomes is now you have to replace old depreciated generators with new generators over a flattening and decreasing demand shape on something that's a 50-year-old live asset. So how are you going to structure your deal to make that economic in a situation where you have all these uncertainties going on? So that's affecting us. Investor preference is changing. People that we're finding, the investor community used to be, particularly the markets were built on merchant generators. Investors are not really willing to take merchant risk, partly because of this load changes that are going on, partly because of regulatory uncertainty, partly because wind and solar is getting cheaper. And so how could you tell your board you're going to invest in a gas plant or a coal plant or a nuclear plant, if you even could do it, knowing that all these changes are going to occur and you may never get a return on that asset? And then for us, the other piece is customer preference. People are wanting to be more independent. We're seeing more microsystems, virtual power systems, people wanting to go off-grid, or people just wanting to have more knowledge and more control. Climate change is affecting us in Australia. This is not a policy debate, it's a reality. We work very closely with the Bureau of Meteorology. So one of the concerns AEMO has, of course, is we have to forecast and make sure we have sufficient supply year over year. What we're seeing is with the rate of change of the amount of heat waves that we're seeing, and not only the intensity of temperature, but the duration and the spread, where you could have multiple cities with hot weather, our ability to predict that is changing, because it could happen or couldn't. It's just these climate events And when they're combined with things like drought and fires, so when there's a bushfire and it's near a transmission line, just like happened in Sydney actually last weekend, we are very concerned about losing Sydney. You guys didn't know it, thank goodness, because of the fact that the bushfires were near 5 transmission lines that fed the CBD and the airport. So all these things are sort of affecting our ability to think about resiliency and how do you build a resilient system in light of these effects that we're actually seeing going on today. So those are, I would say, I think I got to 10, are what's happening. And the problem is like a lot of disruption. That happens. It doesn't happen in some sort of nice sequence. You can have a combination of events. So Google could decide to come in and say, we're going to go and we're going to create this incredible system that every consumer device can talk to every consumer device, and we'll manage demand. And we're going to do that using blockchain, so AEMO, you don't even need to know, or the utility doesn't even know what transactions are going on. So it's those kinds of things that we have to think about in terms of managing the transition. But the things that aren't changing, and we know it'll be kind of somewhat chaotic, is that energy itself, both gas and electricity, is an essential service. We can't run the economy without energy that is cost-effective in terms of it's competitive and affordable and can produce consumer welfare, reliable, and meeting other policies such as emission policies. So the challenge we're having, and that's why I think we see this debate has to go on, is that we can't afford not to have a chaotic transition in energy, because it is creating all the agitas that we're seeing today when people are unclear about policy and they're worried about whether or not government is involved. And so things we're talking about is lunch, is the amount of intervention we're seeing from government is because of the concern that the market itself is not able to work it out, and government needs to help. And as we all know, sometimes when government helps, it's not such a good thing, because you never really want to pick a technology. And so part of what we're trying to do then through my NEMO, the AMC, the AER, as well as the Energy Security Board, is really implement Finkel, which was about how do you come up with a sound transition, and really thinking about not that the industry's not going to change, because it's inevitable. It's changing. It's not like we can stand up and say, let's go back to where it should be. This is not, I mean, it might be political, but we can't make it great again. It's changing. And so the issue is, how do we make this change work for consumers? So what I'd like to do is, we've talked about all these events, and AEMO has tried to simplify this in our own mission into what we would say are the 4 critical features that we need to start thinking about in order to help us get through the transition. Not that we know where the end is going to be, but to manage it so it can continue to produce benefits for consumers. So the first is around planning for, really, I would say, the peak of the system. So I am concerned that we're in a position where, for example, Queensland this year, we hit 3 peaks, not one. So 3 days in a row, we hit all-time peaks. And so that's, this is after years of not seeing the system peak, but that was because we had hot weather and humid weather that hit simultaneously. And so and fortunately in Queensland, we have a lot of surplus power. So while we hit the peaks, we had plenty of energy available to us. Our concern is if that happens in areas where we don't have as much additional resources, such as South Australia or Victoria, we could be in trouble. And so one of the things AEMO wants to do is make sure that when we're looking at the adequacy of energy, we're looking at it not just during an average day, but we're looking at where it could be if you ended up having what the BOM is saying. It could be a 48-degree day in Sydney. And what does that mean? And what does the system need to look like? And how would your coal plants really perform in that kind of weather? So thinking about that and planning for it is important to us, because unlike any other product, if we happen to run out, we can't run to the local grocery store and pick up a spare bottle. It has to be there. So one of the things we're thinking about is how do you do that productively? And one way to do that, of course, is not suggesting we build generation and transmission and distribution just in case, but think about what kind of resources we have available, including embedded resources that sit behind the meter, sit at an industry, that we can use so that if, for example, we have a few hours, that we can say, boy, it would be really great, and this is what happens in the industry anyway, we have all these air conditioners that people can cycle off for 15 minutes, and nobody would know, but it would be the equivalent of turning on a power plant and would save us a ton of money. Or we have a battery at a manufacturer, and we could work with the manufacturer and say, you know what, we will pay you to charge up your battery if you agree to discharge it between 5 and 7, because we're going to need you then. And so working with consumers and working at the edge is going to be very important to us, and that's a very different market than we've had before. So thinking about that is going to be important. But it's also, I think, down the fairway of what you want a modern industry to do. Because you think about it, well, how you rate industry today in the digital economy is not about energy spend. It's around capital spend, it's around capital productivity. So thinking about how we make all these investments more productive and more valuable, not just for the individual owner, but for the market as a whole, is going to be very important, and I think is the way we need to think about this industry. The other area that AEMO is very much focused on is around thinking about how to pay for value. So part of the problem we have today is that we know, because so much of the system is variable, meaning wind and solar, and that we can't really predict exactly what's going to happen. And it's not and people will say, well, if you could forecast better. Well, we could forecast temperature pretty well. We can actually forecast usage pretty well against temperature. What we can't forecast that well is whether or not the wind is going to shift at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock. And if that wind shifts at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock and it changes dramatically, for us, that could be a very difficult thing to manage. So what we need to do is we have to pay for resources to be available that are dispatchable, and that could be demand resources, storage resources, traditional thermal, but tell people, because it's really a operating reserve, that we don't pay for today. So what's happening today, and we see this in South Australia a lot, is AEMO's having to intervene into the market and direct units on, because they're not, the price in the market is not high enough for them to pay for the gas that they need to make available, and yet we need them. And so it's not fair. And it's only because the change is that we have resources that have zero marginal costs competing with resources that have a short-term marginal cost, and they're fighting for the price. And the way our prices are set, it's the price is set at the last increment to meet demand. If somebody turns on a generator and you have excess surplus, it drives the prices down. So the best thing for these generators to do is wait for AEMO to intervene, and then we pay them an administratively set price. So the market needs to be fixed to give these folks the right price signal so that they can make themselves available and it's fair to them. My concern is that some of these changes, and why I think this is important and should be important for everyone, is that right now, because of the changes that are happening in wind and solar, it's very difficult to make a business case to build a gas plant, because they're not in the market enough to recover their investment, and there's so much uncertainty. And so unless someone has what we call native demand, residential load that they can count on, we're finding it very difficult. My concern is that unless we start valuing dispatchability and flexibility well and clearly in the market, we're also going to have problems retaining existing resources. And I think that would be a problem, because we wouldn't want plants to close prematurely and then have to replace it with other plant, because what's really not changed is the physical nature of the system. We have to run an integrated system. In order for the system to work, demand and supply have to equal out all the time. That means AEMO always needs to be able to either turn something on or turn something off, because when supply and demand don't balance, we lose, the system becomes unreliable, and we have blackouts. And so having the ability to really create a payment scheme for availability is very important to us, and it's going to also avoid the risk of us losing units and then having to put more units on or buy new units that are more expensive. So in another way I think about it, we need to sweat the assets we have as long as we can, because that may be the most economically efficient thing to do. But who knows? The market will respond. It's just that we need to have the right price signal. So one of the areas we're very much focused on is how do we pay for the services we need? And one of the services we need is the ability for entities to respond to a price signal. So that's a big focus of ours. The third focus relates to the first, which is paying for demand reductions. Again, our job is to keep the system in balance. That means that we need to make sure demand and supply equal out all the time. If we can equal that out by using resources that sit behind the meter, where people are able to switch because it's economically valuable, that's not turning something off. It's saying, I have storage or I have a generator, I want to use that because it's valuable to me. Or I was talking to a manufacturer yesterday. They have to routinely maintain some of their resources. They can determine when the time is. And so if they can take their units out at a price signal and get paid for it, it's valuable to us, it's valuable to them. That's the kind of integration we need to see. It's that kind of productivity. So we need markets that better value the capability of demand to be flexible as well. That will also allow us to do things like I was saying, is actually pay people to consume during the low hours of the day, and that will make the whole system more efficient. And then the last thing is planning. So one of the things that I think is very important to think about is that this system, when it was built in the last century, was built by integrated monopolies, whether they were government-owned or private monopolies. And so people built transmission and generation based on what they saw as needs in the system. Moving forward is a very complex matter because we have very regulated networks and then an unregulated market. But the generators need the transmission to be there. And sometimes what we need to think about is that we might have, for example, a need to build generation in New South Wales, and yet surplus sitting in Queensland. And it would be a heck of a lot cheaper to build an interconnector between Queensland and New South Wales for those few hours a day that we need that Queensland generation, than build a new generator in New South Wales that may never recover its cost of capital. And so planning is around how do we take a holistic picture of what's happening across the NEM, what kind of investments are coming in across the region, and what sort of investments may make sense, not from an individual standpoint, but a whole system standpoint. And that also needs to include, by the way, pipeline investment. We can't be thinking that we're going to have rely on natural gas generation and not have pipeline investment and supply to meet that gas generation. So it's taking that view. So all of these things, frankly, were identified in Finkel as areas that would be supportive of the transition, but from our perspective are very critical as we move forward. So, I think that the real story around Australia, though, about this, and I think it's, people ask me why I came here. The reason I came here is all these issues are happening, but they're happening here faster, quicker than anywhere else in the world. And the difference between Australia and Europe, any European country, or frankly any American economy, is we're an island, and we have to fix it. We can't do like what they do in France and say, well, we're a little bit long, we'll build an interconnector and ship the power down to Spain. We don't have that luxury. We don't even have the luxury of the UK that can build underwater cable and take advantage of the European market. So we have to fix it here. And the other thing is the rate of change here is happening faster than anywhere else. So to me, the advantage we have in Australia is that if we figure this out, where the new energy economies are going, particularly in the developing world where there's still a huge amount of people without any access, it's these kind of resources and these kind of capabilities that they're going to need. And I think the irony is around Australia is just like Australia was such a powerhouse around energy before, it will continue to be so, but it can continue to be so both in terms of the old types of resources as well as the new resources. And so I think that, rather than feeling pessimistic around this industry, people should get optimistic and get behind, how do we make this change happen and how do we make it work? So thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Audrey, for cheering us up. I think the overwhelming consensus when you read the newspapers is that we're pessimistic about energy policy in this country. You've showed a ray of hope. Now it's time for Q&A, and our first question comes from Michael Katz.
Thanks very much, Audrey. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for a terrific survey, and I'm glad you're doing that job because it sounds pretty tough. But the question goes to, you described your job very much as one of managing the need for resilience, which is obviously the cri du jour. But at what stage and when do you also introduce an absolute price target for Australia for energy? I mean, is that a relevant part of your job, do you think, that we have a genuinely competitive price for energy?
Well, it's not AEMO's job per se, but I am a member of the Energy Security Board. And I do think, I mean, the Energy Security Board and the issue of affordability is absolutely a key issue. And it's affordability, I think, you know, that is a matter of concern, I would say, at both ends of what you think about in terms of energy. I mean, in terms of power, gas and electric, what you're really worried about are your most price-sensitive customers, and they tend to be your larger energy users as well as people who are lower income. And having policies around that are going to be really critical. The question that we have, and one of the things we addressed in the National Energy Guarantee, in the design of that, is how to make the market more transparent, how to encourage more competition, to ensure that you're really helping with respect to affordability. And of course, one of the things AEMO's worked on is in terms of gas supply and making sure that was available as too. So I think there are a lot of various things that are going on, and we're starting to see the effects. The forward curves, price curves are coming down, probably never to the level that people would like them to be. And then the last thing, I think, is some of these market changes. You know, if we can make the system more productive and avoid some of these price spikes and take advantage of the technological change, that will help as well. So it's very much top of mind. And I think the various things we're doing are all around driving towards using competition, using innovation, but at the same time, you always want to keep your thumb on in the scale the right way because it is an essential service.
What about, I mean, you're from America, so you've obviously followed closely the debate about shale gas in the United States. And some economists believe that US emissions are coming down largely because of the shale gas revolution, fracking revolution. I know coal seam gas is different from shale gas, but are you struck that in this country we seem to take a more regulatory position on coal seam gas compared to the Americans on shale gas?
Well, it really depends on where you are in the U.S., where folks feel. I was in New York, which was objected to fracking. But I come from Pennsylvania, where the economy has had a huge boom because of fracking. But I think the real issue is that what's happened in the U.S. is that gas has definitely changed the nature of both the emissions profile and the energy profile. I mean, the issue that right now is in the U.S. is actually gas is so cheap that coal and nuclear are having a hard time remaining competitive. So the question now is becoming, if you want to replace all of the coal with natural gas, because there's always a belief you want to maintain diversity in your resource mix. And if we change that, if we retired all the coal, the amount of gas we would have to build is huge. And so there's I mean, so it's what's been interesting is that no question that one way to help hit an emissions target is to retire a coal plant. But the other side of it is that what happens if all that coal and nuclear does retire? What are you going to replace it with, and can you afford that much gas, particularly if you think you could run into a gas shortage? And that's what has happened in New England, where they've become totally dependent on natural gas. And so you've had these huge price spikes when they have these cold things. So I guess the real interest, to me, the real issue around energy is that you should always think about a portfolio. And you don't want to ever become dependent on one source of fuel, because it's, there's things that can happen to those fuel sources.
Coal seeing gas in this country?
That's something I won't get into. It's sort of not our position.
Next question, Adam Conley.
Audrey, Adam Connolly. Absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you. You talked about your industry being driven by 10 key transitional factors, which are fundamentally going to challenge the sector for a long time. You talked about the 4 mitigating factors then that are driving your response. That's an interesting discussion about process. I was wondering if I could ask you to look into your crystal ball then and help us understand where we're going to land. So where do you see the sector in the short term in, say, 5 years' time? And perhaps more interestingly, where are we going to be 20 years from now, particularly when it comes to where our energy is being sourced from?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of sourcing, it'll be interesting because there's a lot of changes happening in the industry around, even like solar thermal and things like that. So I really find myself always very cautious, because if you ever go through and you say dumb things that smart people have said, so predictions are usually wrong. But I'll tell you where I think we need to focus in order for the sector to be successful over the next decade. I am truly concerned around the issue of uneconomic bypass. I think that the fact that people could leave the system and are leaving the system because they're finding it unaffordable and putting on their own resources is a good thing for an individual if they disconnect, horrible for the rest of us, because what happens, it's a single system. And that means you have less and less part of the consuming base that's having to maintain this system. And because these costs are allocated across the denominator, if the denominator gets smaller and smaller, then what happens is you have this huge have and have-nots. And that becomes just a recipe for government intervention, right? Because you cannot simply say, well, too bad for you, you got to pay for the entirety of the networks because you were the last ones here to turn out the lights. So we have to think about that transition. The way I think we need to do that is really focus on the productivity and how to get the prices to the point where you don't have uneconomic bypass. And that, to me, is really how do we animate this demand side and how do we think about how to use the resources we have and make sure the market is competitive as possible so you're not in a position where folks may be charging monopoly rents. And so I think focusing on productivity of the existing system, focusing on, that means using technology to manage demand better so we don't have these peaks, and focusing on having to pay for resources in a fair way and promoting competition around that will be the best thing that we can do. So we don't get in the way of innovation, but at the same time we don't invite uneconomic bypass because our policies have put people in a position that, especially businesses, that their survival depends upon going it alone. That I think would be a bad outcome.
Michael Cowter, you touched on the portfolio of coal, gas, and nuclear in the United States. Of course, in Australia, we don't have a nuclear industry as such. Like the former question, Adam and I, we've both worked in politics, and we've, for a number of years, and we've the topic of nuclear has really never come up, much more than a discussion. So, I've always thought it would be a great policy measure. I'd love to be a champion of that area. But tell me, is that going to happen in Australia? And is there any appetite from the energy companies to even go down that path?
Well, I think they're this is not AEMO official, obviously. This is my view on these things, is that, the nuclear industry in the U.S. has basically thrown sort of the white flag and say there's no way we're ever going to build another nuclear power plant because it's too difficult, too expensive, and too much policy uncertainty. We were just talking about this at lunch. If you think about the nuclear industry in Europe and the U.S., so where people are building nuclear power plants today in China In Japan, it's because of government involvement. In England, it's government involvement. It's very difficult for a private market to build a nuclear power plant because by the time you start building it, you've probably done two government rotations.
Should the government look into it though?
Well, and then the other question is cost. Yes. I mean, I think about it, and I love Australia, but the markets here are really small. So until I think you see modular nuclear happening, where the units are much smaller, like 200 megawatts, and you could do that cost effectively, but then your challenge is how to build the industry. Because you don't necessarily kind of just, how do you get people trained and sharing? So I think it takes a pretty deep government policy and commitment in a way that is very difficult, I think, to do at this period of time. So that's sort of my honest answer. It's not pro or against nuke. It's just really a complex business to grow, heavily regulated, needs a whole lot of apparatus to be successful, and it's very hard, I think, for a government to have that kind of political commitment because you can't predict it. So I think that becomes a challenge. It's a challenge in the U.S. too. Not that we're great at anything, but I mean it's even a challenge in big markets.
Time for two more questions. Andy Canard.
Audrey, about batteries, are they ever going to make a big contribution to base load or taking away? I'm talking about batteries. Will they ever will they become a form of base load and also taking away demand at some peak times?
I think storage, in general, chemical storage, pumped hydro, will become very, very useful in this industry. It will help with firming of wind and solar. It could also help, for example, people putting solar and storage in their homes and being able to regulate how they use energy. So I think it'll become increasingly a game changer for the way that the industry needs to operate and how that might work in the future. The issue, of course, with batteries is they have to be recharged, and so you do need a complementary type. So you can't think about it as just batteries. And the other issue that we worry about, and this is, I don't sound like a Debbie Downer about anything, but we can go for 2 weeks without any wind. So if you're using a battery to think you're going to use it, and we have days and days of stillness, that becomes a problem. So again, I'm always going to come back to, first of all, we're just we're trying to get through this transition, and we do need to think about all these things, and we do need to think about how these effects can happen, and learn as we're doing. So I would say never on anything, but let's be real around what happens. That we can't control the weather, and right now, weather is one of our biggest fuels, and we're learning how to manage through that.
One final question, Gordon Weiss.
Gordon Weiss, fascinating talk. I'm just wondering how many of the challenges that we're facing could be addressed by cost-reflective pricing for all assets, both generation and network assets.
That's how it used to be under a regulatory formula where it was cost-based. So if you're going to do that, though, and this is really, it's a fundamental change, you would have to say, well, then we have to go back to full regulation. Because if there's an obligation to serve, in other words, all I can get is recovery of my costs, nothing more, then there has to be an obligation to buy. And I think trying to put that genie back in the bottle and saying we're going to basically create regulated monopolies would be pretty much impossible. So I don't think that's useful. I think what we need to do and what we can do in Australia and where we could lead is really how to get competition from the demand side to compete with the supply side, and that's how we can start driving down prices. And we never could do that before because, of course, we didn't have the capability to manage demand. Now we have distributed resources, and we can manage that, and now, for the end, create a more productive system. And I think that, to me, if I could say, where do you want to focus, I would say let's focus on that.
Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you.
The Centre for Independent Studies is blessed to have a very distinguished board of directors, and I'd like to call onto the stage one of our members and directors, Ross Grant, to do the vote of thanks.
Audrey, thank you.
Sure.
That was terrific. When I came here today, I thought energy policy, energy markets were complex, and you haven't disabused me. What you have done, though, is show to us that we, Australia, are very fortunate that you have been attracted to the other end of the world to run AEMO, if I pronounce that correctly. No, your ability to present the issues so that even I can understand them clearly, articulately, and without an overlay of ideology or emotion. It was impressive, and we thank you for the time you spent with us today.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you, Audrey, and thank you all for being here today. The next event we have here at CIS will be during the budget week with the former Treasurer, Peter Costello. You'll receive invitations soon enough, so we hope to see you then, and thank you again for coming today. All the best.